Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm Jihan Inside from class WG3, semester 6. Okay, today I will presenting my material is language learning infancy. First, the first is introduction. Learning language is one of the most impressive and intriguing human accomplishments. Think about the vast difference between the 12-month-old child who says "aha" with hands held up in the air, either to be lifted from the high chair, and the same child 6 months later using recognizable word combinations coordinate with gesture. Example, mommy out. Within the next year, the child will start using an impressive complement of more photosynthetic skills to produce actual sounds that reflect considerable linguistic sophistication. Example, Mom, I wanna get out this chair now. The child's desire may be equally intense in, in each of these situations, yet clearly the typical 2 years old has advanced significantly beyond the 1 year old in their ability to effectively use her native language to make that particular desire known to those around her. The goal of developmental psycholinguistics is to map the endogenous and exogenous force that confers to shape and guide his set of developmental achievements. Over the past 5 decades, the field of language development research has been at the center of the debate between narratives and constructives, constructives approach to understanding human cognition. In the early 1960s, Chomsky's proposal, the language acquisition was initially guided by a language acquisition device were a powerful solution to the logical problem of how children learn language, a view still ardently embraced by many in the field. Since that time, however, an alternative view has been uh, gaining momentum, gathering logical and empirical support for the idea that a child's linguistic knowledge is a construct rather than, than triggered, emerging as a consequence of the child's experience with the linguistic and non-linguistic world. Next, natives' views of language development. How and why does the child's linguistic behavior change so dramatically over such a short period of time? Much of the research on this topic has shown that this process, driven by innate and highly specialized mental structure, that is, learning language involves the operation of a specifically linguistic maturational bioprogram or universal grammar as it processes specifically linguistic input. According to this perspective, this innately specific system is what makes it possible for the child to determine which of all the possible linguistic world systems characterize their particular native language. Indeed, the goal of much research in modern linguistics has been to map the diverse set of principles and features that describe the rule system of any and all of the world's language. Of course, in setting out on this chanting text on is soon struck by the vast ranges and complexity of human grammars. Language is a complex, specialized skill which develops in the child spontaneously without conscious effort or formal instruction is deployed without awareness of its underlying logic is qualitatively the same in every individual and is distinct from more general abilities to process information or behave intelligently. These reasons some cognitive researchers have described language as a psychological faculty, a mental organ, neural system, and a computational model, but I prefer the immediately quantum instinct. It covers, it conveys the idea that people know how to talk in more or less the sense that spiders know how to spin webs. Spiders spin spider webs because they have spider brains, which gives them the urge to spin and the competence to suck it. Three, applauding massive new perspectives on language learning. Although native views of language acquisition are forceful and still widely endorsed, there has been ongoing controversy about the education of such theories as an account of how children develop competence in language. Some critics directly challenge the logic of arguments made by Chomsky's Pinker and like-minded theories, questioning such core assumptions as the universally of generative grammar, the autonomy of syntax in language processing, and the fundamental unalienability of language. Other critics focus on empirical evidence consistent with particular narrative assertions. For example, the claim that negative evidence is not available when children make grammatical errors and assumptions that are to the profile of the stimulus. Argument at the heart of Chomsky's theory is not supported by a recent analysis of parents' reformulations in speech to children. This is the first challenge, both philosophical and data-driven, have fueled debate over follow decades about the explanatory education of native stories of language learning. However, in recent years, this debate has begun to change in focus and tenor, not only in response to explicit critiques within linguistics and developmental psychology, but also in response to research findings and theoretical insights from the further field. An alternative perspective on language learning has been gathering force amplified by new language development. We focus on full-stack development that have begun to change the direction of research on early language acquisition with the emergence of more user-friendly theories of language and language use. Second, the contribution of computational approach to modeling language processing and learning. Third, provocative findings from experimental research on learning and cognitive processing by infants, and fourth insight from studies with children and non-human primates on the role of social cognitive and communication. Next, new ways of understanding language and language arts. While generative theories have favored a view of linguistic competence defined exclusively in terms of grammatical knowledge, recent developments in both linguistics and psycholinguistics have shifted their focus to a more inclusive view of competence, one that incorporates performance factors that guide language use. Within the newly emerging area of cognitive functional linguistics, use-based theories emphasize the essential connection between the structure of language and how language is used to communicate. According to this view, linguistic competence cannot be reduced to knowledge of a core grammar, as Chomsky claimed, but rather draws on a wide range of cognitive and social capabilities and knowledge from diverse domains, rejecting fundamental narratives, assumption about the nature of language use-based theories demand a very different view of what is involved in language learning. In psycholinguistics as well, there has been a dramatic shift away from models of speech processing that embody natives' assumption in favor of models that emphasize statistical and probabilistic aspect of language. Until recently, dominant emphasize the dominant processing theories have been those that reinforce the modularity of language, focusing on synthetic parsing strategies presumed to be automatic. For example, adults were reading potentially ambiguous sentence such as put the apple on the table into the box are confused and predictable ways to result from of an irresistible initial tendency to interpret the propositional phrase on the towel as modifying the verb and thus specifying the destination of the action. In fact, the phrase PP modifies apple rather than pot, a reduced relative clause that attached to the noun phrase rather than the verb phrase, catching the reader by surprise. Such classic garden pet effects will replicate the hundreds of experiments based on native assumptions, providing support for the idea that default synthetic processing strategies are automatic and impervious to influence from other of information. Next, learning strategies in infancy. A third area in which recent developments have challenged traditional assumptions about language acquisition is research on infant learning strategies. When Skinner 1947 proposed that language was a behavior like any other animal behavior that could only be learned through gradual shaping and external reinforcement, Chomsky 1949 emphatically rejected this idea. The common observation that children begin to talk correctly in the absence of explicit positive or negative feedback was clear to odds with the idea that language learning is achieved through a process of conditioning. Chomsky's claim that principles of learning could not possibly explain how students master language was based on the behavioral learning theory of the day, which was much too simplistic to account for the complexities of children's linguistic ability. In recent years, however, research investigating early perceptual and cognitive development have made stunning discoveries about the learning capacities of young infants, and a new view of the potential role of learning in language development has emerged thus, while computational models reveal how much information about language structure is potentially available to the young language learner. These new behavior studies confirm that infants are in fact able to learn from this information. 4. Learning about the sounds of speech in the first year. To begin making sense of speech, infants must discern regularities in the sequence of sounds used by speakers of the particular language they are hearing. Hundreds of experiments on speech perception in the first year of life have shown that months before understanding or speaking a single word, infants become attuned to characteristic sound patterns in the ambient language. While early research in this area focused on discrimination and categorization of consonants and vowels, More recent studies are exploring infants' implicit learning of complex distributional patterns in spoken language and how these learning strategies enable infants to find words using multiple sources of information available in the source patterns of continuous speech. Next, early attention to speech sounds. Given the importance of findings in what is now regarded as one of the most exciting areas of research in cognitive development, it is hard to believe that infants' sophisticated speech processing abilities are a relatively recent discovery. To give some historical perspective, in 1970, Bernard Finlander published a research overview entailed receptive language development in infancy. Issues and problems motivated by the following concerns, judging by the theoretical and speculative literature as it stands today. Receptive language development in infancy is a minor topic of marginal significance. Issues related to infant listening and receptive process are virtually ignored. The new wave language studies that assume torrential proportions in the early 1960s, so there is a general acknowledgement that the language input is necessary prerequisite for the organization of speech. The topic is seldom accorded more than a few sentences, and some of these discussions are highly patronizing in tone. They seem to suggest that auditory perception in general and language perception in particular are topics on which thoughtful observers would hardly need to spend much time. There is little in this literature to suggest that the problem of how babies come to recognize the phonological, lexical, semantic, and grammatical system in the language they hear represents a psychological, linguistic, and developmental problem of the greatest magnitude. Next, finding the words in fluent speech. Other studies of developmental change speech perception have focused on the discovery procedures infants use to identify higher order elements in spoken language. An influential article by Lila Gliedman on colleges stimulate this new research direction. They proposed that infants might be able to use certain prosodic features in continuous speech, such as pauses and the vowel lengthening typical preceding pause as cues to the boundaries of phrases and causes a perceptual discovery strategy that could be useful to the child beginning to learn syntax. This prosodic bootstrapping hypothesis generated considerable interest, leading to experiments showing that 10-month-old infants seemed to recognize violations of common prosodic rhythms in the ambient language. Kamler, Nelson, Hirsch, P. and Cassidy, 1989, thought there were also counter-arguments against the view that prosodic cues are sufficiently regular as to provide reliable cause to syntactic units in speech. The prosodic bootstrapping hypothesis stimulates the first wave of research exploring how infants might use lower levels acoustic cues in speech to gain access to linguistic structure at higher levels. 6. Lexical development. These studies of early speech perception show that infants in the first year of life are becoming skilled listeners, capable of making detailed distributional analysis of acoustic phonetic features of spoken language. Although such accomplishments are often cited as evidence for early war recognition, they are perhaps more more appropriately viewed as evidence of pattern detection abilities, prerequisite for recognizing words in continuous speech. Identifying particular sound sequence as current acoustic pattern is obviously an essential step in word recognition, but this can occur without any association between sounds and meaning. Laboratory studies show at around 5 until 6 months of age, infants respond selectively to their own name, and by 10 months appear to have some kind of acoustic phonetic representation for a number of frequently heard sound patterns. Because this selective response to family word in the early months of life can occur with no evidence of comprehension. It may constitute word recognizing in only limited sense. However, most infants do begin to respond and to and other sounds in meaningful ways by their first birthday, and 1 year later are able to speak the zones of words quite convincingly. In this section, we review research on children's first speech production and the cause of early vocabulary growth, as well as the factors that influence further learning in infancy. 6. Listening for meaning in speech in the second year. Infants' early progress in developing language is often charted in the terms of their increasing competence in understanding, producing, and learning individual words, an ability that is arguably shared in some respect with other species. However, the ability to understanding and use word flexibly in combination is a critical distinguishing feature in human language. Of course, it was Chomsky's 1949 who pointed out long ago that multi-word sentences are much more than individual words strung together one by one. Grammatical sentences are made up of units of words that vary in size and are organized hierarchically in a large but finite set of complex ways that are not always obvious from the surface level ordering of the words, while traditional views had that the language learning child must be innately endowed with such grammatical knowledge. Recent perspectives have continued to examine ways in which such professions can be constructed over the course of development. In this section, we refer to recent research on how infants develop impressive emphasis in understanding words in continuous speech across the second year and on how they begin to use words in combination to express increasingly complex meaning through language. Okay, thank you. This is my presentation today. Thank you. You have to work hard. You can be a successful person if you work hard. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.